High summer at Kirby Hall in Northamptonshire, and 1,500 reenactors from more than 50 societies meet for a huge festival of living history and military reenactments. It's English Heritage's most spectacular presentation of the year. Careful planning, good weather and enthusiastic participants combine in an unforgettable weekend, as colourful displays demonstrate the evolution of military uniforms and tactics from the Romans to D-Day. For this is the story of History in Action 2. In AD 43, the Emperor Claudius unleashed an army of 50,000 soldiers to conquer Britain. Now, 7 societies joined forces to recreate a full century of 80 imperial legionaries. The first time you're seeing a force like this for around 2,000 years. Augmenting the legionaries are auxiliary infantry and cavalry, highly trained and well-equipped. Easy to see why many historians refer to the Roman army as the Panzer division of the ancient world. With superb discipline, excellent armor, artillery, and sophisticated battle tactics, the Romans were nearly always able to overcome their enemies, who were usually lightly equipped and often ill-disciplined tribesmen.
The legionaries were the backbone of the Roman army. Over a woolen tunic, they wore body armour made from segmented iron hoops, and on their head, a helmet with neck and cheek guards. They carried throwing javelins called pila, a stabbing sword, and a rectangular shield that could be used either for defence or as a weapon of attack. Auxiliary soldiers tended to be less elaborately armoured, wearing chainmail and a cheaper bronze helmet. They carried a stabbing spear and an oval shield suitable for skirmishing. Archers were also used. Each legionary century had its complement of officers. The signifer carried the signum or standard. The cornicum, a horn player, relayed orders on the march and in battle. On detached duty, the vexillarius carried a small flag depicting the legion from which the troops were drawn. The optio was second in command, but the most important officer was the centurio or centurion, who commanded the unit.
Some of the Romans' most famous military tactics have come down through the ages. This is the testudo or tortus, a formation used in sieges or assaults on enemy fortifications. The legionaries would place shields over their heads and on the front and sides of their formation. Thus protected, they could approach a gate or weak spots in enemy defences with minimal casualties. The only effective defence against the testudo was boiling water or oil, probably not used in Western Europe. Covered by their artillery, the testudo would approach the enemy fortification and, once in place, hold its ground. Next, using the testudo as a shelter, engineers set fire to wooden foundations or attacked walls. Once a gap was created, Roman reserves would charge in. In pitched battle, on open ground, the Roman army employed various tactics. Artillery would first disrupt the enemy. Next, legionaries would throw volleys of javelins, causing grievous casualties on unarmored opponents. The javelins were designed to bend on impact, so the enemy couldn't throw them back. The soldiers could then advance in line, shoulder to shoulder, each man covered by his shield, gladius ready for one bayonet-like thrust. But perhaps the deadliest tactic of all was the wedge, an arrowhead formation used to cut into the heart of enemy lines. A steady advance was followed by a charge at the run, which tore into the enemy and put them to flight. Roman reserves and cavalry followed, turning defeat into rout, the soldiers ruthlessly killing everything in their path until ordered to stop by their officers. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Roman army was at the height of its power, having conquered a territory stretching from the sands of Egypt to the borders of the Persian Empire, from the German forests to the northern frontier of the province of Britannia.
The cavalry would train as vigorously as the infantry, learning to use a variety of weapons, including the long slashing sword called a sparta, the spear or hasta, and throwing javelins. Although the Romans didn't possess stirrups, the clever design of their saddles enabled the rider to stay firmly on his horse.
There you go. So this sort of exercise will get the horse used to the idea of coming up towards the target. So here we go. Going to try and cut the target. The best they can do is continue to leave part of it still on the snout. This is the principle of the horse archery, where you would have hundreds of soldiers mounted on horses equipped with bows and arrows. They could ride up to an enemy, shoot off their arrows for as long as they like until they themselves.
After practicing against stationary targets, a cavalryman would train against infantrymen, who moved around. If the cavalryman could maintain speed and shock value, then he'd probably win the fight. But if he was forced to a standstill, the infantryman would have the advantage.
Although the Roman Empire would last for hundreds of years, the army was most successful in the 1st and 2nd centuries. On a hot summer weekend at Kirby Hall, that army marched again. When in the 6th century the Roman Empire in the west fell, the province of Britannia was gradually submerged by Germanic invaders and colonizers from the continent. In time, this became Anglo-Saxon England, a kingdom which was to survive until the Norman invasion of 1066. On the 14th of October that year, Duke William of Normandy defeated the Saxon army at the Battle of Hastings and killed King Harold Godwinson. But William the Conqueror would be forced to stamp out several rebellions before England was fully under his control.
The Saxon warriors fought on foot, which could place them at a disadvantage against the Normans, because their army contained large numbers of heavily armed cavalrymen, a tactical innovation new to England. Although the cavalry couldn't hope to break a Saxon shield wall, they could work round its flanks, pick off individuals, and like the Roman cavalry, turn defeat into rout. Defeating the enemy army was down to vicious hand-to-hand fighting between infantrymen armed with swords and spears, supported by archers, particularly on the Norman side. Many of the soldiers were unarmoured except for a helmet and shield, but those that could afford it, and especially mercenaries, would almost certainly be protected by chain mail.
Accompanying the armies at Kirby Hall were individual living history encampments, each complete with craft skills, food, and fireside gossip, a unique opportunity for visitors to catch a glimpse of everyday life in previous centuries.
Sounds like we had fun.
In the 15th century, the Wars of the Roses saw England crisscrossed by soldiers fighting either for the House of York or of Lancaster. The nitty-gritty of war hadn't significantly changed for around 400 years, except that is for one major innovation: gunpowder.
However, battles were usually decided by hand-to-hand combat, most soldiers using the bill, a particularly vicious weapon. Most soldiers wore a helmet, and many would also have body armour, either metal plate or a jack, a padded cloth garment with steel plates sewn into the lining. Archers could also take a terrible toll of an enemy force. Knights were encased in a complete suit of armour and were protected from many of the appalling wounds inflicted by edged weapons. Hand-to-hand fighting, irrespective of social rank, was, however, extremely dangerous and exhausting. As the power of artillery and handguns increased, the importance and relevance of armour diminished. Even the English longbowmen, once supreme on the battlefield, could now be bombarded from a safe distance by cannon.
Medieval soldiers didn't march alone. On campaign, they would be followed by a huge tail of camp followers, tradespeople who were willing to provide each and every service required. Families, cooks, priests, armourers, anyone with connections to an army on the move. So although life on campaign could be harsh, at least some comforts could be found, at a price.
16th century England was largely a peaceful place, a mood reflected in some of the living history encampments at Kirby Hall. In one, a Tudor household spreads a linen cloth on the grass and recreates an enjoyable afternoon picnic with authentic period dishes, all on show to visitors and eagerly consumed by the participants.
I know of no way we can use much time, but have someone there all the time. Not labour sufficient. Young Mistress Catherine did scare them off a few times, but extremely unhealthy. blamed on Henry, but it was not him at all. Yes, smooth.
Meanwhile, the household's menfolk and one of the ladies practice archery at the butts. Despite this proficiency with the bow, the state of England's land forces during the Elizabethan period was absolutely lamentable. It's probably just as well that thanks to the Queen's Navy, England's militia was never called upon to face the formidable Spanish army. Throughout the Tudor and early Stuart period, it was felt that there was no need for a standing army in England. But this was all to change with the onset of a great civil war.
By the 17th century, technical advances in the use of gunpowder had revolutionized warfare. Armies now consisted of regiments of infantry, known as the foot, together with cavalry, the horse, and dragoons, essentially mounted infantrymen.
An infantry regiment consisted of two types of soldier, musketeers and pikemen. Although the 16-foot ash pikes carried by the pikemen were used in hand-to-hand combat, their most important role was actually protecting musketeers from the enemy cavalry during the cumbersome loading process. Initially, muskets were very heavy, so rests were used. As the war progressed, however, muskets became lighter and rests discarded. Regiments were deployed up to 8 ranks deep, allowing pikemen to form a dense hedge of points against enemy cavalry or infantry. Musketeers could keep up a rolling fire, front rank firing while the ranks behind reloaded. Cavalry were also equipped with firearms, usually pistols, but their main weapon was the sword.
God shall smite you down!
At the start of the war, most soldiers were raw recruits, officered if they were lucky by veterans of the 30 Years' War in Germany. Regiments were so inexperienced that they made serious battlefield errors, opening fire too early or panicking and running when attacked by a resolute enemy. Soon, however, things began to improve, and infantry could relatively easily drive off enemy cavalry. Musketeers were the real killers on the battlefield. They were armed with a matchlock musket fired by plunging a burning length of combustible cord into a powder charge held in the priming pan. But this type of musket had its disadvantages. It used up a lot of expensive match cord, which needed to be kept alight during battles. The burning cord could also be a safety hazard. It could accidentally set off the powder charges which each soldier carried in a wooden bottle across his body. And it would be absolutely deadly anywhere near gunpowder stores. As a result, soldiers guarding the artillery and powder stores were often issued a different type of musket which used a flintlock mechanism. Without the smouldering match cord, it was much safer. It also couldn't be seen at night, whereas the glowing match cord of the other musketeers could be and could give away their position.
By the end of 1644, with no end to the English Civil War in sight, Parliament took a momentous decision. It formed a professional standing army out of its 3-week existing field forces. This was the famous New Model Army, commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax, with its cavalry led by Oliver Cromwell. Defeating the king decisively at Naseby in June 1645, the New Model Army went on to roll up all remaining royalist resistance, except for a few isolated garrisons, within a year.
Towards the end of the war, both sides were highly proficient, and battles could be very hard fought. In infantry combat, opposing musketeers would exchange fire and then advance to contact, using muskets as clubs. Musicians played an important part in the English Civil War, with drummers relaying orders in the din of battle. Drummers were experienced soldiers and not the young boys of later armies. Fifers were also used to play jaunty tunes which kept up morale amongst troops on long marches. But while the battles raged, tucked away in Kirby Hall's courtyard, another part of history in action was quietly underway. In the historical traders' market, over 50 craftspeople made and sold specialist items to visitors and reenactors alike.
In the meantime, can afford to wear a new pair of socks.
For much of the 18th century, Britain was at war with France. In 1745, its soldiers were also forced to contend with Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite rebellion in Scotland. Most Scots supported the government rather than the Jacobite rebels, but all the same, in the absence of the British field army away on the battlegrounds of Flanders, the nation was left in a perilous state. A disastrous battle at Preston Pans near Edinburgh convinced the government that they should withdraw regular troops quickly to deal with the Scottish rebels.
The British redcoat was armed with a smoothbore flintlock musket with triangular socket bayonet. the latter invented at the end of the 17th century and directly leading to the demise of the pike on the battlefield. The combination of cold steel, discipline and firepower proved decisive during the Battle of Culloden. Many Jacobites were mown down or bayoneted as they attempted to force their way into the redcoat lines. Jacobites were also mostly armed with muskets and bayonets, either supplied by the French or Spanish. Few could afford swords, so the popular image of sword-wielding Highlanders is only part of the truth. Augmenting the redcoat forces on this occasion are soldiers from the American War of Independence, fought 20 years after. These troops wore white crossbelts, waistcoats and breeches.
The Jacobites defeated, Britain engaged in a number of further campaigns against the French. Amongst the more significant was the conquest of Canada, known as the French and Indian War. Despite early reverses, the Redcoats eventually drove the French from the continent of America. By the mid-19th century, power of the infantry had increased enormously with the introduction of rifled muskets. Fired by a percussion cap ignition system, this new weapon could be used in all weathers. Its killing range improved, and the rate of fire, hitherto just 2 or 3 rounds a minute, very much speeded up. During the American Civil War of 1861 to 65, the accuracy of the rifle became all too apparent.
Because battlefield tactics had not evolved in line with weaponry, and armies still engaged each other in shoulder-to-shoulder formations at close range, there were enormous casualties. General Pickett's charge at the decisive Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 showed exactly what could happen to mass formations exposed to enemy rifle fire. In just 20 minutes, half of the 13,000 Confederate infantry engaged were cut down as they attempted to storm the Union lines. By the end of the war in 1865, tactics had been updated, with more open formations being utilised.
The carnage of the American Civil War over, visitors to History in Action 2 witnessed a more gentle spectacle. A field review of Queen Victoria's army, as it might have been towards the end of the 19th century.
This featured the recreated 17th Lancers, the famous Death or Glory boys of the Charge of the Light Brigade, carrying out mounted and dismounted manoeuvres accompanied by jaunty music from a yeomanry band. Volunteer artillerymen load and fire a 16-pounder muzzle-loading rifled cannon. This 100-year-old artillery piece was hauled on and off the field by a horse team, especially recreated by English Heritage and the Royal Armouries. Meanwhile, the Redcoats demonstrate fire and movement utilising original Martini-Henry breech-loading rifles, the weapons that devastated the Zulus and other brave native enemies.
The 20th century brings in an era of total war, in which technology rules supreme. To have any chance of surviving on the battlefield, soldiers have to be as inconspicuous as possible. The Great War of 1914 to 18 demonstrated the deadly nature of artillery and machine gun. By 1939, and the declaration of a second war against Germany, firepower had become awesome, now made even more deadly by the decisive use of air power. Following D-Day in 1944, the Germans, including many with valuable combat experience gained in Russia, fought hard until they were crushed by overwhelming numbers, firepower, and the total air supremacy of the Allies. In this sequence, taken from the first History in Action event, British and American troops fall into an ambush set by the Wehrmacht.
handle of the First World War. Very serviceable, very reliable field weapons. It did service in some armies in the Third World. They continued coming up until the early 1960s. Very good purpose weapon.
As the day drew to a close, the high point of History in Action 2 was a grand finale which featured all the participating societies, Romans to Normans and Saxons, the medieval era, English Civil War, 18th century American Civil War, and Victorians to World War II. As the massed troops marched onto the field, visitors enjoy the spectacle of the massed flags and drums, pikes and cannon, together with all the uniforms and accoutrements of 2,000 years of history.
First, the mighty soldiers of Rome. Behind them, imperial soldiers of an altogether different era, those of the 4th and 5th centuries, by which time arms, armour and organisation had changed radically. Behind the Romans marched Saxons loyal to King Harold Godwinson, followed by their deadly foes, the heavy infantry of Duke William of Normandy. Next, a large confederation of 15th century medieval reenactors make a colourful sight as billmen, bowmen, handgunners and artillerymen advance in column. Many formations of soldiers are accompanied by their camp followers and families, all attired in correct period clothing. These soldiers are even headed by an image of a saint, a bid to ensure their place in heaven when the time comes. The steady beating of drums announces a column of 17th century infantry, representing soldiers from the early part of the English Civil War. Musketeers and pikemen march to an almost mesmeric rhythm. And then King Charles I's nemesis, the red-coated soldiers of the New Model Army of 1645. Confident, superbly uniformed and equipped. Disciplined, victorious in battle. But let's not forget the loyal and experienced troops of the King, here represented by the Marquis of Winchester's regiment, which garrisoned Basing House until overthrown by the New Model Army. In just a few paces, we move forward 100 years as British redcoats of 1745 and 1776 appear, resplendent in their uniforms and carrying the famous Brown Bess musket and bayonet. Their courageous foes, the Jacobites, French infantry, and Native Americans, follow in column of march. Next, British light infantry from the Duke of Wellington's army of 1812 to 15, here portrayed by the 68th Regiment of Foot. They're followed by green-coated riflemen and a detachment of Napoleon's 21st Regiment of the Line in their distinctive blue coats and tall shakos. Throughout the weekend, these Napoleonic soldiers carried out impressive living history displays amongst the huge encampments surrounding Kirby Hall. Billy Yank and Johnny Reb advanced to the sound of fife and drum. The blue-coated Union troops followed by the grey or butternut of the Confederacy. Next come the smartly dressed redcoats of Queen Victoria's army. The German Wehrmacht of 1944 marches again. As does its American and British foes. Many of the items of uniform and most of the weaponry carried by these reenactors are original. Particularly striking is a World War II Red Army unit complete with female soldiers, and a detachment of East German troops from the year 1989 wearing uniform and equipment acquired after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The infantry are accompanied by a scout car in full 1950s working order. And at the rear of the column, the superbly uniformed South Notts Hussar Yeomanry Band, who, throughout the weekend, had entertained the audience with stirring military music.
So if the 25-pounder guns fire, we're going to have some very dead Napoleonic troops on our hands. So the Napoleonic soldiers might be not a bad idea if you were to move.
With the armies formed upon the field, it was time to salute the audience. First, in chronological order, regiment by regiment, century by century.
Duke of Normandy!
And finally, a massive volley from musket, cannon, rifles and field guns. A spectacular end to a memorable event.
Ladies and gentlemen, history in action 2.